Okay, now this next chapter is on pooling, and it's called Net Revenue Interest Calculations of the Mineral Owner in a Pooled Unit. But before I give you the problem, let me just explain to you a little bit about what pooling is. So pooling is state laws that are enforced by state conservation agencies. So in Texas, it's the Texas Railroad Commission. In Louisiana, it's the Department of Conservation. In Oklahoma, it's the Oklahoma Corporation Commission. And what it says is that you can only have one well for so many acres. So if you think back to the early days of oil and gas drilling, before there was a pooling provision, you literally had to drill a well under the rule of capture. You literally had to drill a well on every single lease, because if you didn't, your oil would be drained by your neighbor. So if you wanted the property, if you wanted the minerals, if you wanted that oil interest, then you had to drill yourself. And so literally in those early days, if you think back to Titusville, Pennsylvania, when the first well was drilled, um, there was literally just derrick after derrick after derrick after derrick, and they were so close that some of them actually crossed legs at the derrick. So you would have to drill a well, because if you didn't, your minerals would get drained by your neighbors. So that's what it looked like. Now, states began to realize that this was not good for drilling. It was expensive for the oil and gas company, and there were some studies that showed that 75% of the reserves were left in the ground, because when you had that many holes in the ground, it reduced the pressure of any one well. So you think about a garden hose, and if you punch one hole in it, you're going to get a lot of water flowing to that one hole. But if you have a bunch of different holes, you're just going to have a little trickle from each of these other holes. So that's a very basic explanation of how this works, but it does have to do with pressure in the earth. So what happened was the states kind of were on this track anyway. But in 1933, there was a man named George Strait. Not George Strait, not the country western singer, but George Strait. And George Strait had the notion that there was oil and gas in Conroe, Texas, of all places. So instead of having to lease from all these people and risk draining, he actually bought all the property. So he didn't have to worry about leasing. And he had one well in there instead of well after well after well. And that one well was the biggest producer since Spindletop. And so now states really started to pay attention, because they realized that um, if we put one well in the ground, it was better for everyone. For one thing, it would produce more oil, but everyone would benefit. Now, but what happens if you have a bunch of royalty owners, a bunch of leases in this area? If the state says you can only drill, let's say, one well for every 160 acres, and usually in a pooling situation, we put the well in the middle of the unit. That means this person doesn't have a right to get any royalty payment, and this person doesn't, and this person doesn't, because there's no well drilled on their land. So I think this went to the Supreme Court, and they said this was taking without due process of law. So under the 14th Amendment, they couldn't do that. So they came up with these laws that said pooling laws, and they're also known as a pooling unit or spacing unit. And what it said was, if you have one well, you can unitize. In other words, you can file for this unitization with the State Conservation Commission, and then every owner then would get a share of this well, of this production, even though the well wasn't on their property. So everybody benefits, because the well doesn't have to be on your property in order for you to get a share of it, but your share is going to be reduced by the number of acres that's actually in the unit. So, for example, if we say this is your acreage here, and let's say that that is 40 acres, and you have a 1/8 royalty. So the formula is going to be this royalty interest times the lease acres, or what we call the tract acres. And let's say this is a 640 acre unit. Tract acres divided by the unit acres. So this would be a royalty interest, which is the 1/8, times the 40 acres divided by 640 acres. So we know 1/8 is a 0.125, and now we're multiplying that by 40 over 640. I think I know the answer, but I don't want to guess wrong. 40 divided by 640 equals a 0.0625. So now we're multiplying this royalty interest times the tract over unit interest, and that equals a 0.125 times a 0.0625, and that interest is going to be, the net revenue interest is going to be let me get it again, 0.0078125. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of the history of it. Don't worry if you didn't catch it this go around. When we work the problem, you'll get it. But I just wanted to start with a kind of a little lecture, if you will. So let's look at the net revenue interest calculations of the mineral owner in a pooled unit. So let's just read it together. Farmer Brown owns a mineral interest in a 160 acres of land. He leases his land to Cajun Drilling for a 1/8 royalty interest. Cajun Drilling requests a well permit for gas and forms a 640-acre pooled unit. This could be a pooling unit, a drilling and spacing unit, a drilling unit, a spacing unit, all kind of different names for this. And the question is, what is Mr. Brown's net revenue interest? So we're going to plug in this formula. We're going to take this 1/8, which by now we know that's a 0.125, and we're going to multiply it. Hang on, we're not doing this yet. We're going to multiply it by the tract acres, which in this case is 160, divided by the unit acres, which is 640, and that's going to be the net revenue interest. So if we do this calculation out, we know 1/8 is 0.125, and 160 over 640, we know that that's 1/4, or 0.25. So this answer is going to be it's going to be a 0.125 times 0.25. It's going to equal 0.03125. So already you can see how we're starting to get these really long decimal interest. So that net revenue interest is 0.03125. Okay, let's look at another problem.